we're going to have Dr. Dulcie McKenzie. She's going to talk about how the media report and understand Black majority churches in the UK. She's very well qualified to do so. She's a former BBC broadcaster. She's now the director of the Centre for Black Theology at Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Knowledge in Birmingham, and has a PhD in Black Theology. And her research interests are the history of the Black Church and the rise of Black gospel music in Britain. Dulcie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger, and it's really good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I have, 15 minutes or so, so I'm going to jump straight in and not lose a moment because there's a lot to say. So You Don't Understand Me is my brief, and how the media report and understand the Black churches in the UK. So I'm going to be going to share thoughts, and my thoughts around religious media and Black churches in the UK. And I want to focus on the relationship between the two, specifically how Black churches are treated by the religious media. And when I say Black churches, I mean Black Pentecostal churches. We could sit here for the next 2 days deliberating what we mean by a Black Pentecostal church, Black majority church. But to keep things simple, I'm talking about Black Pentecostal church where they are African diasporan people. Leaders and the congregation are of African descent, and Black Pentecostal congregations across the UK. So the churches were founded and led by people from Africa or African Caribbean. And I want to share this journey in terms of talk about this, drawing on 3 strands of my own personal and professional journey so far. I'm a lifelong Pentecostal, and I have to say I'm also a PK. My parents, they were ministers in Pentecostal churches, and I'm a former radio presenter, as Roger mentioned, with the BBC. For many years, I presented and produced a Black gospel music program. So some 30 years later, I am still alive and well. And I am now a theological educator on the front line, training leaders and ministers from Black Pentecostal churches. And so it is with these 3 distinct experiences that I come to this conversation. Now, I've been told I can be as provocative as I want to be, so here I go. I'm making the claim that the mainstream religious media, specifically religious broadcasting on TV and radio, have failed Black Pentecostal churches. In fact, they have failed 3 generations of Black Pentecostal churches. And I'm going to attempt to show you how, for Black Pentecostals, the religious media have made themselves intangible, irrelevant, and immoral. And when I say intangible, the religious media exists, but it isn't really readily accessible to Black Pentecostal churches. When I say irrelevant, religious media provides a national service, but has little meaning, little application, or is of no significance to Black Pentecostal churches. When I say immoral, it might be a bit strong, but what I mean by that is it is not consistent with its own principles of diversity and inclusivity. Black Pentecostal churches are marginalized, and the religious media play a big part in that. So I'm going to try and illustrate where the religious media has failed the Black Pentecostal churches so far by its treatment of 2 particular features of Black Pentecostalism in this country. And I want to look at its history, how the churches have grown and progressed, and its congregational worship, its liturgical contributions. So essentially, the media is there to educate, to inform, and to entertain. Pentecostalism is the fastest growing division of Christianity worldwide. And here in the UK, Black Pentecostalism is a thriving faith community. However, it is usually overlooked by the religious media, or, as I will explain shortly, treats Black Pentecostals with a bias motive. So let's look at church history. And I want to start this conversation about church history and Black Pentecostalism in this country by reflecting on the experience of my parents and their generation. My mum and dad were migrants from Jamaica who arrived in Britain in the early 1960s. They were part of a larger group of African Caribbean migrants who subsequently came to Britain after the first cohort of migrants from the Caribbean. And we know the story well, don't we, that they arrived on the now well-known ship Empire Windrush that docked in Tilbury in June 1948. And this is why then they are called the Windrush generation. Now, details of the experience of the migrants is very much part of the narrative of church history in this country. Back in Jamaica, my parents, for example, were devoted members of Pentecostal churches. My mum, for instance, was a young member of a Pentecostal denomination called the New Testament Assembly. And my dad, who became a minister in the 1970s, was a very active member in the Church of God in Christ. Now, when mum and dad arrived in Britain, they were able to find a job with relative ease, but they struggled to find adequate accommodation. Back then, it was common to see a sign saying no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. So they had little choice about where they could live. Available to them then was essentially a rented room, sharing a bathroom and kitchen with other tenants, which was common for most African Caribbean migrants in those days. My parents and other members of the Windrush generation didn't realize then that life in Britain would have been so hard. Coming from a hot climate like the Caribbean in comparison to Britain, it was bitterly cold and the people were not always friendly. Relative to our conversation this afternoon is the difficulty that my parents and other members of the Windrush generation had in finding a place of worship and how they responded. They arrived as fellow Christians, and although they knew that they wouldn't find in Britain Pentecostals like they had back home, they assumed, indeed they assumed, the right to worship freely in the host churches. But for many, and my mum and dad, this was not the case. My late dad often shared a particular story of a vicar thanking him for attending the Sunday morning service, but suggested that he should not come back. Instead, try the other church down the road, as they would be happy to welcome his kind. Sadly, my dad's story is not unique. There are many other examples of that experience shared by many other migrants who received a cold reception by host churches in this country in those days. Despite the hardship and misery of settling into British society, at least for some, they had their Christian faith to help them to survive. Some chose to continue attending the host churches, but it is the response of the Pentecostal migrants that I want to amplify here this afternoon. While some felt led by God to start a church in Britain, many others reacted to the rejection of their fellow white Christians. Because of the rejection they experienced at the hands of the host churches, many of the migrants joined the pioneering effort to create a sacred space of their own to have Christian worship. They initially met in their own bedsits and front rooms, and as the gatherings grew larger and larger, they relocated to school halls and other public venues. These small gatherings grew into larger congregations and soon became credible church denominations with governance in North America. As the churches grew, there was wider attention, especially by researchers and the media. Social scientists describe the congregations as sects. In other words, S-E-C-T-S, just in case you misheard me, sects. In other words, the congregations were not seen as respectable churches. And the media then were keen, very, very keen to show congregations possessed by the Spirit. Consequently, leaders and members of the congregation were suspicious of the media and they preferred to keep them out. A lot has happened since then for those churches, and these churches have provided not only spiritual guidance, they have provided for many educational, social, psychological, and financial help. And this decade is a significant period for many of the historic Black Pentecostal churches across the country. For instance, this year, the New Testament Assembly celebrates its 60th anniversary. Next year, the Church of God in Christ celebrates its 70th anniversary. And in 2023, the year after, the New Testament Church of God and the Church of God of Prophecy will be celebrating its 70th year. So for some 70 years, there has been a distinctive form of Black Pentecostalism on British soil, which was birthed and has flourished as a faith community independent of state support or governance. And let me add, the support of the religious media. I have focused mostly on the historic African Caribbean churches, but there are other Black Pentecostal churches that should be mentioned. Standing on the shoulders of the first generation of African migrants is a second and now a third generation of Pentecostal leaders. Flowing alongside as another stream of Black Pentecostalism, if you like, is the flourishing of African-led churches such as KICC and Redeemed Christian Church of God. Here's a couple of questions, or maybe two or three, to finish off this part of talking about church history. When it comes to the holistic history of Black Pentecostals in Britain, what has been the response of the religious media so far? Have they adequately featured the founding members? Has religious media adequately investigated the contribution and legacy of these churches? How might the religious media make this part of church history more central to British history in its media coverage? Let's talk now briefly about Black congregational worship, because it is the birthplace for Black gospel music in this country. So metaphorically speaking, gospel music is a child of the Black church. What tends to happen though, is the child of the Black church is often invited by the media to come out and play, but the invitation is rarely extended to the parents or other family members of the child. As another way of looking at this, it might be helpful to compare an analysis of representation and what often happens when a Black character or a Black family is included in a soap opera. There's a suggestion that the soaps adopt three approaches when they try to include a Black character. The approaches are exotic, a vehicle, or an incorporation approach. Let me explain. When we have the exotic approach to including the Black character, the Black character is used as a bit of a quirkiness, a bit of a drama to a story. We may never see them again, but they are brought in to add a little spice. I'm thinking now, forgive me, EastEnders, Mo, the character Mo, she had a Black boyfriend, didn't she? Called him Elvis. We saw him once, never again, he disappeared. Let's talk briefly about a vehicle approach. The vehicle approach is where a Black character is sometimes brought in to channel a particular story. It is possible to see that the Black character is on the periphery. They are included to highlight a particular storyline. And the storyline is usually problematic. It's an experience of marginalization, maybe racism, maybe homophobia, or it's a random storyline of some sort of a spiritual or psychological trauma or some kind of distress. And then there's the third approach, which is incorporation. This approach has been very rare. Remember what we're talking about. We're looking at Black gospel music, for example, and the musicians being invited to be part of something. But we are looking at the comparison of a soap, where in the soap operas, noticeably things have changed within the last year, where Black families, Black characters are brought in and added to a soap community, and their character forms part of the ongoing narratives. So their life and their storyline is incorporated into the ongoing life of the soap community. So I'm thinking, again, forgive me, of Emmerdale and the new Black vicar and his son, and then also another Black family in the Coronation Street drama, where we have a Black family and the soap directors are trying their best to incorporate Black characters into the soap family. So to conclude this point, get on with it, Dulcie. When it comes to religious media, there is a tendency to treat Black Pentecostals like Black characters in soaps. Black Pentecostals either receive a one-off call to be part of a program to add a bit of Pentecostal spice, exotic, or they receive an invitation to be part of a program to bring an element of Black Pentecostal tradition to an event, to an occasion, in response to a crisis or an issue. They are a vehicle for an alternative view. There is no doubt, though, that Black Pentecostals are not consistently incorporated into mainstream religious broadcasting. Often there is a hegemonic racial and ecclesiastical representation, and Black Pentecostals are not usually there. So because Black Pentecostals are not consistently at the soap opera religious family dinner table, it can be said to be a faith community that is seamlessly incorporated in religious broadcasting on TV and radio. It cannot be said that they are incorporated. To borrow a phrase from a fellow Black theologian, Dr. Robert Beckford, the Black church is represented in the media in two ways, the choir or the conflicted. In other words, we can expect to see the choir at particular times, at Christmas, guaranteed, Easter, Pentecost Sunday, and now and again on certain religious programs. Or if there is a high profile issue or a story that relates to the Black community, there is a tendency for the media to call on a Black clergy for a reaction. Robert calls them the conflicted, and they're invited. Some questions to think about. What would it look like if the religious media properly incorporated the Black church? What would it really look like if it had more than the exotic or the choir approach? What are the elements of Black church history as its congregational life that the media needs to pay more attention to? Just want to finish off, just keep my eye on the time, on one last element, which is the area of theology in terms of, for the last 7 years or so, I've been involved in the mainstream ministerial training for leaders and laity of Black churches. I direct a centre that sees Black lives and Black experience as essential to doing theology. It is my ongoing commitment to teaching Black theology, womanist theology, contextual theology, and other forms of liberation theology that is helping me to raise more critical questions about religious broadcasting in this country and its need to be more diverse and more inclusive. Since I started with the BBC in the late 1980s, and even since my departure some 2 years ago, I'm not convinced that inclusion or the reporting of Black Pentecostals in religious media has improved. I spent 21 years presenting and producing a gospel music program, and that was a space indeed for Black Pentecostals. But then that program was axed, and all of the other gospel music programs locally were taken away, as it were, and then made into a magazine program. So that's my own personal experience there, suggesting that things are going backwards rather than forwards. My time's running out, but I want to make one more point, if I can, and raise another question. Within the last year, the impact of two major events, that's the global pandemic and the reaction to the death of George Floyd, has been transformative for all of us. We have all seen how there are many more alternative platforms for different groups to find expression to share with others. I've been amazed, and I'm sure you have too, at how Black Pentecostals in particular have seized the opportunity to broadcast who they are online. The opportunity for Black Pentecostals to broadcast online means that the mainstream religious media is even more intangible and irrelevant. I also said at the beginning that the religious media is immoral. And you may ask, how can I say that? When it comes to Black Pentecostals in religious media, the lack of diversity and inclusivity is blatant. Considering Black Pentecostalism is the fastest growing division of Christianity in this country and the world, it has to be said, the principle of accurate and authentic representation in the media is breached, which makes it immoral. I'll end with a final question. Why is there such a continued dominance of whiteness representing Christianity perpetuated in mainstream religious media, such as TV, radio, and the press, when Black churches are flourishing in this country?
Dulcie, thank you so much. Magnificently and necessarily provocative, and very important to hear. Thank you for your contribution today.